For the César Chávez Foundation, the Chavez family, we want to thank Madeline Mercado Volker and the Center for Diversity and Inclusion and its Hispanic Heritage Committee and all the sponsors of tonight's event for letting us share with you today. Also want to thank Gilbert and our student speaker, Uzi Mendez. This year marks the 50th anniversary of Cesar's decision to begin building the United Farm Workers. 50 years ago, in 1962, Cesar took stock of himself. He was 35 years old. He was the staff director of the Community Service Organization, which, as the film said in its day, was the most militant and effective Latino civil rights and civic action group in the Western United States. It was really the first steady job he ever had in his life. He got paid a decent salary. His family even got to take a week's paid vacation every year. It was the first decent job he had since being a migrant farm worker beginning in the 1930s. And the first time the family did not have to scrape by to pay rent and to buy food. So when he made the decision to give up that job, you know, Cesar and Helen, they knew the risks and the long odds against success in trying to create a farm workers union. Helen especially worried about what would happen to their 8 small children that were then between 3 and 12. Cesar came to see what he called the trap most people get themselves into, tying themselves to a job for security. But he quit the job and he moved to a little dusty farm worker town in the California Central Valley called Delano, California. His wife had to go back to work in the fields with their older children. Cesar also worked in the fields on weekends. He babysat his youngest kids as he drove to little farm worker towns up and down the Central Valley, trying to recruit farm workers into his infant union. It was a very tough sell. Cesar would talk to 100 people, and maybe 1 or 2 were not afraid to take a risk. He would often return home after being on the road for days and not having recruited anybody. He would get depressed and dejected. His wife Helen would buck him up, and she would tell him, "Cesar, I have faith in you. I know you're going to succeed. You're doing God's work." In 1962, President Kennedy's administration offered Cesar a job to run the Peace Corps in part of Latin America. It would have meant living in a big house with servants and all the advantages for his kids. Cesar turned down the job in exchange for a life of voluntary poverty that was with him until he died. So founding the union was really a leap of faith, not just because the odds were against him, but because Cesar still had serious doubts. He didn't know that he would succeed. But he did it anyway because he said that he couldn't live with himself without trying. By the mid-1960s, those early baby steps became the Delano Grape Strike. It was the longest continuing farm workers' strike in American history. The workers became transformed as they learned to do things they never thought they could do. They rolled out of bed after 3 hours sleep at 3 in the morning to be on dark picket lines by 5 a.m. They were arrested for violating unconstitutional anti-picketing injunctions. But too often they were beaten and clubbed and sometimes shot by grower goons and rural cops for engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience. And finally, they moved the picket lines from the vineyards to supermarkets and cities all across North America to boycott grapes and then other products. They appealed to people in colleges and churches and unions. It was the first time in American history that anyone had applied a boycott to a major labor management dispute, but eventually millions and millions of Americans, 17 million Americans according to one nationwide poll in 1975, were boycotting grapes and other products. 2.5 years into the strike, some young strikers were becoming impatient. There was no hope of victory anytime soon. Some of the strikers talked about resorting to violence, to responding in kind to the abuses that growers were subjecting them to. Some of the strikers equated nonviolence with inaction or even cowardice. Cesar believed nonviolence is more powerful than violence, and that it would support you if you have a just cause. But for Cesar, nonviolence was more than just a strategy or a tactic. He once said that if, in order to build the Union, required the deliberate taking of a human life, either the life of a grower or his child, or the life of a farm worker or his child, then he would choose not to see the Union built. Cesar didn't teach people by lecturing them. He led by example. So following the example of Cesar's hero, Mahatma Gandhi, Cesar announced in 1968 that he was fasting to rededicate the movement to nonviolence. He went without food for 25 days, only drinking water. It was an act of penitence in the Catholic tradition for those in the Union who were advocating violence, and it was an act of penitence for Cesar, accepting personal responsibility as a leader of the movement. In 25 days, Cesar lost 35 pounds. His doctors said that his life was in danger. But the fast worked. All the talk of violence stopped. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King contacted Cesar expressing admiration and solidarity. At a big mass celebrating the end of the fast, the late Senator Robert Kennedy came to Delano to be by Cesar's side, calling him one of the heroic figures of our time. Cesar was too weak to speak, so his statement was read for him. He said in part, "It is my deepest belief that only by giving our lives do we find life. The truest act of courage, the strongest act of manliness, is to sacrifice ourselves for others in a totally nonviolent struggle for justice. To be a man," Cesar said, "is to suffer for others. God help us to be men." Since Cesar's passing in 1993, countless communities across the nation have named parks and schools and libraries and streets and all manner of things to honor him. But the greatest monument to Cesar Chavez is not seen on a street sign or in concrete. It is in the continuing work of the Union he founded and gave his life to. As we honor the 50th anniversary of that movement this year, Cesar's work continues on behalf of the people for whom he dedicated his life. Farm workers have recently won new protections through the United Farm Workers contracts with the biggest strawberry grower in America, with the biggest winery in America, with one of the biggest vegetable growers in California, with 75% of the fresh mushroom industry in this state, with one of the biggest dairies in America, and the biggest winery in Washington State. UFW organizing is continuing with strawberry workers and tomato workers and melon workers and vegetable workers in California. Meantime, the Cesar Chávez Foundation, under whose auspices I was able to come here today, is the other arm of the farm worker movement. The union addresses the injustices farm workers face at work, and the Chávez Foundation addresses the dilemmas that they confront in the community. So, for example, tens of thousands of farm workers and other low-income Latino working families and seniors live in 30 high-quality, affordable housing communities in 4 states that the Chávez Foundation has built and manages. 500,000 immigrants in 4 states tune in daily to Radio Campesina, which is a Spanish-language network of 9 stations offering very popular regional Mexican music, but also state-of-the-art interactive educational programming. You know, after Arizona's anti-immigrant law was enacted a few years ago, a commentator on a newspaper website wrote, "Let's deport all of them. We should deport Cesar Chavez's body too. That would be ironic. They are just taking all the excellent jobs from good Americans." Well, such racial insults aren't new. I was flying out of San Jose, California airport with Cesar in 1979 in the midst of a very bitter strike in the nearby Salinas Valley. And a middle-aged Anglo lady recognized Cesar and said something like, "Why don't you go back to Mexico?" Well, what's ironic is that the Chavez family has been in this country longer than mine and longer than many Anglos. Cesar was born on a small farm that his grandfather homesteaded in 1900 in the North Gila River Valley outside Yuma, Arizona. Cesar Chavez, Cesar's grandfather, for whom he was named, immigrated to this country leading a wagon train in the early 1880s from the Mexican state of Chihuahua, escaping the hacienda system in Mexico. Cesar Chavez ran a hauling business. They cut wood in the mountains and they haul it in these huge wagons drawn by mule teams. You know, like some of you who are more my age may remember Ronald Reagan and Death Valley days in the 50s. That was what Cesar's grandfather did. And it was that wood that helped build the mines and the railroads that were the backbone of Arizona's economy before statehood. I knew Librado Chavez, Cesar's father, who drove a Wells Fargo stagecoach on a rural route in Arizona before the turn of the century. Librado also was a farmer. He was a local postmaster, and he ran a country store. One of Cesar's uncles by marriage, Andreas Arias, witnessed the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone in 1881. So the Chavez family literally helped build the Old West, literally. Still, by the standards that too many people judge success today, I guess Cesar was not very successful. He never made more than $6,000 a year. He never owned a home. He didn't own a car, and when he died at the age of 66, he left no money behind for his family. He was a humble man who was very uncomfortable being singled out for praise. He almost never accepted personal awards. He knew there were many Cesar Chavezes, men and women who made tremendous sacrifices and accomplished great things, but whose names were lost to history. On May 5, Cinco de Mayo this year, the United States Navy is christening and launching its latest Lewis and Clark class dry cargo ship, which it's naming the USNS Cesar Chavez. It's being built in San Diego. Cesar served, as you saw in the film, in the Navy at the end of World War II. When the honor was announced, the Chavez family and foundation acknowledged it, but in the name of all Latinos in this country who defended America and who helped build this country, which is what Cesar would have wanted. You know, how Cesar viewed and treated others was really a key to his success. He liked to say that his job as an organizer was to help ordinary people do extraordinary things. He made everyone in the movement, especially the farm workers, believe that the jobs they were doing were important jobs. It didn't matter if you were a lawyer representing the union in court or you were cooking in the strike kitchen for the strikers. He showed farm workers that they could win against great odds, even if they were poor and uneducated. And by giving people faith, by helping them believe in themselves, I think that's why Cesar succeeded, where for 100 years, people with a lot better educations and many more resources than Cesar had failed to organize farm workers. You know, as the years went by, Cesar realized that his work and the work of his movement had transcended farm labor and gone on to inspire millions of people from all walks of life who never worked on a farm. He was not worried that the UFW would survive, Cesar said, when Latinos in ever greater numbers started going to college, began running for public office, began asserting their rights across a broad range of fields across the nation. He gave a speech to the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco in 1984 that I worked on with him. And in those remarks, he said, the union's survival, its very existence, sent out a signal to all Latinos that we were fighting for our dignity, that we were challenging and overcoming injustice, that we were empowering the least educated among us, the poorest among us. The message was clear. If it could happen in the fields, it could happen anywhere, in the cities, in the courts, in the city councils, in the state legislatures. Once social change begins, Cesar said, it cannot be undone. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. I was 19 when I first got involved with the movement, working on the Great Boycott when I was an undergraduate at the University of California. And since then, I earned 2 college degrees, but the most important lessons in my life I learned were not in a classroom. They were working with Cesar in the movement. Lessons about commitment and sacrifice. Lessons about being part of a cause that's bigger than you are. About what it means to be a man. Someone once asked me, how did a nice Jewish boy like you get hooked up with the likes of Cesar Chavez? And I answered that I always loved history, and it was it was a keen interest in farm labor history that Cesar and I shared together. But once I met him and got to know him and understand what he was trying to do, I figured out it would be a lot more interesting to be part of history than just to read about it. Decades ago, in the 70s, there was a reporter with a national news magazine who spent several days traveling around with Cesar and following him around to farm worker marches and rallies and meetings. And no matter how pressed or tired Cesar was, when he was with farm workers, he would patiently speak with everyone who wanted to talk with him, no matter how long it took. Workers would have him sign autographs on their t-shirts and their flags, their union flags and their leaflets, whatever they could find. Proud fathers, they had these little Instamatic cameras in those days, and they would take pictures with Cesar and their kids. So at an interview this reporter did with Cesar after seeing him for a couple of days, and she asked him, what accounted for all the affection and respect that farm workers showed him in public. And Cesar smiled his easy smile, and he simply said, the feeling is mutual. In other words, he felt about them the same way they felt about him. Uzi was mentioning the importance of being a role model. Cesar looked remarkably and dressed remarkably like the people he was trying to help. If you didn't know who he was easy to lose in a crowd. People, farm workers and Latinos especially, would see him and they would say, you know what, he looks just like my father, or my brother, or my son. And you know what, if Cesar Chavez can do these remarkable things, then maybe I can too. It's exactly what Uzi was talking about. There was a great deal of adversity. The FBI followed Cesar around for about 10 years on orders from J. Edgar Hoover. And after Cesar died, a couple of reporters I know with the LA Times and Sacramento Bee filed Freedom of Information Act requests and got Cesar's FBI file. It's about 1,400 pages. And they read them. And the agents kept telling their headquarters that, after they followed him around, they even placed agents in his organization. And the agents kept reporting back, well, he's not doing anything illegal or immoral. He's not a communist. And yet the FBI kept after him all those years. Back in 1979, we were in Washington, D.C. I was advancing one of Cesar's national tours, and at the end of a very long day, we were on the National Mall, and after, the 11th or 12th appearance, that interview he was doing, was with a TV news crew from East Germany. In those days, this is before the fall of the Berlin Wall, East Germany was a communist country. And the correspondent with this East German TV outfit was asking Cesar questions, some very leading questions. And basically, they wanted Cesar to say that all the abuse and exploitation that farm workers faced was a result of the American governmental and political system. And I could tell when Cesar was kind of pissed off, and he was not being very communicative. He cut it off as soon as he could. And as we were walking away on the National Mall with the Capitol Dome behind him, and got out of earshot, he remarked to me, he said, they wanted me to criticize my country, he said. I have the right to criticize my country. They don't. So the irony was that the FBI was being un-American, and Cesar was the one who was a patriot. Look out later this year, hopefully in the fall before Election Day, there's a full-length motion picture about Cesar that filming starts next month. Keira Pearson, who was the screenwriter who was nominated for an Oscar for Hotel Rwanda, is writing the screenplay. Diego Luna is the director. Michael Pena has been cast as Cesar. America Ferrara as Cesar's wife, Helen. So take a look out for that. You can get more information about Cesar and the farm worker movement online at the United Farm Workers website, which is ufw.org, and where you can also sign up to get their regular email updates and participate in farm worker campaigns by email, signing petitions and so on. Also, the Chavez Foundation website is chavezfoundation.org. There is a wealth of background about Cesar and the movement and what's going on today there as well. It has been a privilege being with you. Again, my thanks for going to the trouble of inviting us out for this event. And I just want to leave you with some of Cesar's words that President Obama borrowed in his 2008 campaign for president, "Si se puede," which actual Spanish translation is, "Yes, it can be done," or as President Obama said, "Yes, we can." Pleasure.